Since watching this movie, I finally understand what a true horror film is. The movie consists of 4 terrifying short stories: human body modification, sewer rat people, zombies resurrecting from coffins, and invincible vampires. Each story can make your adrenaline skyrocket. Through the filming techniques of pseudo-documentary, it even made people mistakenly believe it was a real event. It is V/H/S94, released in 2021. The story begins. An armed squad is tasked with a capture mission, but when they enter the factory where the criminals are supposed to be, they find that everyone here has been dead for a long time, and without exception, their eyes have been cruelly gouged out. Meanwhile, a video is playing on the nearby television. It is the first horror short story, Sewer Rat People, which is an urban legend circulating among the people. According to local news reports, an unknown creature suddenly appeared in the small town. It fears sunlight and always hides in the dark and damp sewers. Since then, people often hear eerie screams coming from the sewer. Some even claim to have seen the rat people with their own eyes, but the local priest said some strange things.
It's time for sinners and elitists to get what's coming to them.
Hearing the eerie stories from the local residents, curious journalist Holly takes a cameraman with her and prepares to personally enter the sewer to find out the truth. However, as soon as the two of them arrived at the entrance, they saw a figure standing under a bridge not far away. The motionless appearance looked quite eerie, but it didn't stop them from moving forward. Once inside the sewer, they quickly discovered a makeshift bed made of cardboard, a cart filled with junk, and a tattered tent. All these signs indicated that a homeless person lived here. Could it be that the so-called rat people are actually just homeless individuals? However, while the cameraman was carefully filming inside the tent, he didn't expect to find a person lying beneath the debris. The cameraman dropped the camera in shock. By the time the two of them regained their composure, the homeless person from the tent had already come outside. He squatted on the ground, his body covered in dirt. Looking as if he had been startled, Holly cautiously approached, preparing to interview him, but the homeless man kept repeating the words "rat people" from his mouth. Just as Holly was about to ask him if he had seen the rat people, the homeless man's expression suddenly turned horrifying, and black liquid started flowing from his mouth. The terrifying sight frightened both of them, and they quickly fled. However, while running, the cameraman noticed that Holly had disappeared. No matter how he called out, he received no response. Helpless, the cameraman had no choice but to leave alone. To his surprise, as soon as he turned around, another homeless person appeared ahead of him.
Fuck this.
When the camera turned on again, Holly was already tied up, surrounded by those homeless individuals. She didn't know what these homeless people wanted, but suddenly a familiar voice came. It was the priest who spoke in tongues. Thinking that the priest intended to rob or assault her, Holly pleaded and offered to help the homeless people. However, the priest took the cameraman to a nearby sewer pipe and summoned the legendary rat people from inside. The priest scooped a bowl of black liquid flowing from the rat people's mouths and chanted as he poured it over the cameraman's head. In an instant, the cameraman's face was horribly corroded. Witnessing this scene, Holly was terrified and desperately begged the priest for mercy, but the priest started speaking in strange words again.
Only the righteous shall rise. Your friend wasn't worthy, but you, who knows, all of your sins.
After his words, Holly was brought in front of the rat people. However, she didn't meet the same gruesome fate as the cameraman. Miraculously, she survived, but her eyes had clearly changed, displaying an unsettling gaze. As expected, a few days later, Holly, who was reporting news in the broadcasting studio, suddenly had black liquid flowing from her mouth, directly spraying onto her male colleague's face. Her colleague's face was instantly corroded, and he died a gruesome death on the spot in the studio. Meanwhile, Holly continued to report as if nothing had happened, and in the end, she uttered a cryptic statement.
Hail Radma.
After watching the contents of the recording, the armed squad continued searching throughout the factory, hoping to find survivors. However, when they arrived at a room resembling a screening room, they discovered more corpses. A second story was also found playing on the screen, Resurrected Zombie in Coffin. This is a horror story that happened in a funeral home. A few days after Haley joined the funeral home, she was asked by the leader to keep a vigil for the deceased alone, and also use a camera to take pictures of the process of vigil. and leave it to the family of the deceased as a souvenir. The deceased suffered a serious traffic accident during his lifetime. The whole body was crippled, and it took them a long time to restore the body of the deceased as much as possible. After explaining everything, the two colleagues left the funeral home, but after hearing what they said, Haley, who was alone, couldn't help feeling a little scared. What's even more strange is that she stayed alone for a long time, but no family members of the deceased came to mourn. Even if there are no family members, there should be some friends. This is a bit abnormal. Thinking of this, Haley hurriedly called her girlfriend, asked her to read the nearest newspaper. Did you report the traffic accident of the deceased Andrew? Because she wanted to know whether Andrew died in a car accident? But because there are too many newspapers recently, my girlfriends need time to check them, so Haley just hang up the phone and wait. Shortly after, heavy rain poured outside accompanied by thunderclaps. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the entire funeral home into darkness. Haley, in a state of panic, quickly retrieved a candle from the room, but just as she lit it, the lights flickered back on. Haley had no choice but to blow out the candle and return to her seat to continue the vigil. However, when she turned around, she was startled to find that the previously well-positioned coffin had inexplicably shifted. Considering the coffin was made of solid wood and contained a body weighing hundreds of pounds, it would be impossible to move without the strength of several strong individuals. Perplexed, Haley attempted to restore the coffin to its original position but heard unusual sounds emanating from inside. Filled with fear, Haley immediately called her colleague, informing him that the deceased might still be alive. However, her colleague dismissed her claim, insisting that he had personally witnessed the deceased's lifeless state. He even suggested that Haley might be experiencing auditory hallucinations. As a funeral home worker, if she couldn't overcome this level of fear, it might be time to consider a different job, he remarked. After listening to her colleague's words, Haley reluctantly hung up the phone. She cautiously approached the coffin again, repeatedly confirming whether she was hallucinating, but her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knocking at the door. It turned out to be a close friend of the deceased, arriving to pay their respects. This unexpected visitor relieved Haley's tense nerves, providing some much-needed comfort. However, the man simply sat on a chair, uttered a few simple words towards the coffin, and then left. Haley couldn't clearly hear what he said, but it didn't sound like mourning. Shortly after the man left, Haley's best friend called and told her that Andrew didn't die in a car accident. Instead, he had been speaking incoherently for an hour on top of the town's church before jumping off. Before Haley could fully process this information, the lights in the funeral home went out again, and her call with her friend abruptly disconnected. In a hurry, Haley turned on the camera's light. Unexpectedly, familiar sounds emanated from the coffin once again. This time, Haley completely lost her composure and immediately sprinted towards the exit. However, she found that the door to the church had been locked by unknown hands. Helplessly, Haley had no choice but to return. As she entered the hallway, she discovered that the coffin had been overturned, and the body inside was nowhere to be found. As the camera turned, Haley saw the deceased standing silently in a corner. Believing that Andrew hadn't died, she attempted to communicate with him, but suddenly, the half-faced Andrew turned around and lunged towards Haley, roaring like a savage beast. The horrifying sight resembled that of a zombie. Fortunately, it lacked eyes and relied solely on sound to track its prey. Haley hid under a chair, narrowly escaping its attack. However, as she prepared to create some distance, she noticed the severed hand of the zombie wriggling on the ground. Involuntarily, Haley let out a scream, inadvertently revealing her position. Within a second of the zombie lunging at her, Haley quickly dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding its grasp. At this moment, Haley dared not move a muscle, but when she turned her head, she noticed the zombie's half-faced head staring intently at her. Haley barely registered being discovered before the zombie lunged at her, baring its teeth. After a violent struggle, the zombie collapsed onto the ground. However, the camera captured Haley's strange behavior, indicating that she had also transformed into a bloodthirsty zombie. After the second story concluded, the camera returned to the abandoned factory. The armed team began searching the factory in a systematic manner. Soon, a foul stench filled the air, and one team discovered a room littered with dismembered limbs. In that room, there was a television playing the third story, The Deranged Doctor and His Human Experimentation. In the camera's frame, a man groggily opened his eyes, only to find his lower body had been transformed into mechanical spider legs. It was the Mad Doctor's proud creation. However, The man's body quickly showed signs of rejection and burst into flames. Falling to the ground, the doctor hurriedly arrived with a fire extinguisher. This was his 97th experiment, and it clearly ended in failure, but the doctor had no intention of giving up. He had expertise in prosthetics. To prove to the world that humans and machines could coexist, he began engaging in inhumane human experimentation using live subjects. Initially, the doctor targeted his patients, but he soon resorted to various means to capture physically fit individuals. Soon, the doctor began the 98th and 99th experiments, documenting the entire process with the camera. He cruelly removed the brain of experiment 99 and replaced it with a mechanical one, showcasing his satisfaction with the experiment's apparent success. Through several simple communication tests, experiment 99 showed responses. With this success, the doctor was filled with confidence. Without hesitation, he proceeded to modify experiment 98. He removed experiment 98's right hand and replaced it with a large cleaver, also making modifications to the brain. However, at that moment, a news report suddenly played on the television. It mentioned that the authorities had discovered a large amount of human tissue in the nearby canal. The doctor was now the prime suspect and a manhunt was underway. The young girl who had recently gone missing was experiment 99, named Petro. Upon seeing this news, Petro seemed to regain some awareness. She began to resist, attempting to escape the clutches of the doctor, but the doctor would never allow his prized creation to leave his grasp. He grabbed an iron tray and viciously smashed it towards Petro. At the sound of a knocking on the door, the doctor immediately became nervous, but in the next second, the door was suddenly kicked open, and it was the police who had found the location, due to the doctor's hands being stained with too much blood. Once his identity was confirmed, the police didn't attempt an arrest but chose to execute him on the spot. They then split up and began searching for survivors in the laboratory. However, the police officer carrying the camera noticed Petro lying on the hospital bed. Seeing her altered state, everyone displayed expressions of horror. However, despite Petro's plea for help, the captain disregarded the protests and intended to kill Petro directly. Because she was no longer considered human, they couldn't let her parents see her, and it was also to alleviate her suffering. But just as the captain prepared to take action, the lights in the laboratory suddenly went out. The police officer immediately turned on the camera's light and happened to see Petro taking the opportunity to escape. But he chose not to inform the captain, to prevent the altered human from fleeing. The captain immediately ordered the steel door to be closed. However, as soon as he reached the door, a powerful explosion occurred, resulting in more than half of the team being injured or killed. Suddenly, a pre-recorded audio message from the doctor played through the loudspeaker. It turned out that he had anticipated such a situation and set up traps in the laboratory in advance. If this recording was activated, it meant that he had encountered an unfortunate event, but he would also make those detestable intruders witness his magnificent creations. As soon as the message ended, experiment 98, who had been lying on the hospital bed, was suddenly activated, and using the 40-meter blade on its mechanical arm, experiment 98 directly pierced through the body of a nearby police officer. Upon witnessing this, the teammates immediately opened fire, but the bullets were utterly useless, and they met their gruesome deaths one after another under the blade of the altered human. Experiment 98 was different from experiment 99. It lacked any trace of emotion and was purely a killing machine. In the midst of the crisis, the captain threw a grenade, but the intense explosion failed to kill it. Amidst the chaos at the scene, Petro took the opportunity to escape the laboratory. She arrived at the doctor's office and discovered a set of weapon blueprints tailor-made for herself. She also found the severed upper half of a head. Standing in front of a mirror, she finally saw her altered appearance. Her head and right hand had been completely replaced by machinery. Petro couldn't accept this monstrous form, so she angrily punched through the mirror in front of her. But then, she suddenly heard a cry for help. Petro followed the sound and arrived at another laboratory. She discovered a horrifying scene of half-human, half-machine failed experiments, sending shivers down her spine. At that moment, a police officer suddenly appeared behind her and swiftly knocked Petro to the ground. In self-defense, she began searching for usable tools, and to her surprise, she stumbled upon the weapon designed specifically for her by the doctor. She quickly installed the weapon onto her arm. To escape from the facility, Petro killed every police officer who stood in her way. Empowered by the weapon, the police officers were defenseless. Finally, Petro managed to capture Gary, but Petro knew that Gary had no ill intentions. He had just helped her, and now both of them had the same goal of survival. They quickly agreed to leave together. However, Just as Gary was leading Petro towards the exit, the captain suddenly emerged from behind and fired several shots at Petro. Gary tried to intervene but received a severe beating in return. Seeing that the captain was determined to kill Petro, Gary had no choice but to shoot and kill the captain. However, as he was about to pull Petro up, Experiment 98, the altered human, suddenly attacked. Seeing Gary being brutally stabbed by Experiment 98, Petro quickly got up to help. Although she managed to defeat Experiment 98, she couldn't save Gary. In the end, Petro was the sole survivor in the entire laboratory. Meanwhile, the capture mission on the abandoned factory site didn't seem to be going smoothly either. Apart from 2 team members and the captain, they couldn't contact anyone else. However, as they searched for their other teammates, a television nearby started playing the final terrifying story, The Invincible Vampire. A group of self-proclaimed exceptional criminals claimed to be the embodiment of justice. They believed that the current United States was beyond redemption, and they aimed to replace the government and initiate a massive cleansing. Their bargaining chip was a captured wild vampire. This vampire was no ordinary vampire. Its blood, once exposed to sunlight, would cause a massive explosion. The criminals had injected a tiny amount into a rabbit, and the resulting explosion was as powerful as a missile. If they could harness the blood of the vampire properly, it would be like having a walking nuclear bomb. After extensive field research and planning, the group was preparing to carry out an unprecedented and devastating terrorist attack. However, just the night before the operation, an unexpected incident occurred in their base. To celebrate the upcoming momentous occasion, they decided to hold an early celebration. However, 2 intoxicated revelers had a sudden idea and ventured into the vampire's prison cell in search of excitement. One of them took on the role of filming, while the other grabbed hold of the vampire. Unfortunately, the vampire's blood splattered onto his companion's body. The next morning, the alarm bells in the base suddenly rang out. They discovered that the companion who was filming had already collapsed in the snow, while the other companion, with blood on his body, stumbled out of the prison cell in a dazed state. The moment he came into contact with sunlight, a violent explosion occurred. They realized that the vampire had likely escaped. They decided to enter the prison cell and subdue the vampire before nightfall, as a vampire in the dark would be even more terrifying. Quickly, the group armed themselves and ventured inside. However, when they reached an attic, one of the criminals, who was about to investigate, was suddenly attacked by the vampire. With its gaping mouth, the vampire bit him and killed him instantly. The panicked leader opened fire towards the attic in the belief that he had hit the vampire, leading everyone to charge forward. But they soon discovered that not only had they failed to hit the vampire, but it was hiding in the darkness, launching relentless attacks on them. Screams echoed one after another, and soon only the leader remained, covered in vampire blood. His demise was even more gruesome as he was exposed to sunlight and exploded into bits. Their grand plan had come to an end before it even began. However, as the scene returned to the abandoned factory, the captain was bound by 2 female team members. It turned out that these video recordings were made by a mysterious organization. They specialized in filming depraved movies that others dare not capture, solely for the purpose of gaining profit. They traded these videotapes with an audience that had a taste for extreme content. The 2 female teammates were members of this mysterious organization, responsible for capturing the footage. They intentionally provided false intelligence, luring the armed team to this factory. Their objective was to shoot the next film, and with the rest of the team already dead, they became the thrilling scenes of the movie, and the captain was to be the finale of this film.
Are you ready for your close-up?
What the fuck did you just say?
We're the final girls. You're our final kill.
Stop!